scroll onto the computer, and I shall now spotlight Natalie again. There you go.
Well, thank you very much, and it's lovely to be with everybody. And, if we talk about what my summer or my time since lockdown has been, it's basically endless Zoom meetings. Headingley Green Party in Leeds get the prize for being the first one. I think it was the second week of lockdown that I did it with them when it was all still a very new idea. And my most extreme has been a couple of times I've ended up being in 3 Zoom meetings at once, which quite frankly I don't recommend. Usually one of those Zoom meetings has been an actual session of House of Lords that I'm speaking in. I may also be speaking in something else and possibly happen to speak in something else as well. And I have 3 screens set up and trying to make sure you're in the right place and pointed in the right way and doing the right thing. Quite frankly, don't do it. It's a really bad idea. So that's my kind of, we've been hearing people's recollections. That's my recollections of recent months. But you asked me to speak about Citizens Assemblies. And I'm really glad you did that, actually, because it's the first time. So you're getting another first in here. I haven't also been to a green gathering and anything quite so much as a discussion. And so with that in mind, I'll try to be very brief, because I think if we're going to talk about Citizens Assemblies, something that's participatory rather than me being a talking head is obviously a good idea. So to start off with the sort of general idea of what a Citizens Assembly is, and I expect most people are probably aware of this, but it's worth running through what is and isn't a Citizens Assembly. And I think, lots of people on this call, probably most people on this call will, have been at local public meetings where you get lots of people turning up and there's debate about a particular issue. That's not, however, a Citizens Assembly, because one of the key factors of a definition of a Citizens Assembly is that it should actually be representative of the community or the country that it's making decisions for. And I think we all know that the people who turn up at public meetings, and particularly the people who speak at public meetings, are probably not entirely representative of the views of the public and the views overall. So to do a proper Citizens Assembly, it should be as close as possible, perfectly representative of the community in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of BAME representation, in terms of education levels, which is where it starts to get perhaps more interesting and difficult. It really needs to be a representative body. And if we look at Ireland, for example, which has been one of the places that's really led on this, they put a lot of effort. They've had a 99 strong group representative of the whole country, and they put a lot of effort into making sure those people were truly representative. The other thing that it does, the principle of Citizens Assemblies, is that it's not just a case of people turn up and vote. The model suggests something that's deliberative. So people will actually have a chance usually to hear from experts, to discuss the issues amongst themselves. A very classic model is for people to break into small groups, so they've all got a chance to discuss things and report back, and a kind of model we know quite well. And so it's not just a case of people bringing their preconceptions, bringing their views into the room. There's a very strong stress on people really listening, talking, debating, and forming an opinion rather than just arriving with one. So representative and deliberative. Then the third thing is probably the sort of the controversial bit, and you get lots of different models. I would say that an ideal example of a Citizens Assembly is one that actually is decisive, has some real power to do something. There's a real risk that if you have a talking shop and people don't really feel like they're going to be listened to, this is just going to be a gesture, then they're not really going to take it seriously. Whereas if people who are sitting in that room knowing that their decision is basically going to have a real impact, make a real difference, that's when you get people taking these things really seriously. So that's kind of what I'd say is what a Citizens Assembly is. And I just wanted to share a few experiences, and my personal experience is from the Electoral Reform Society a few years ago now. There was a lot of talk, and it was Green Party policy, and it was probably about 2017, no, actually, no, it'll be older than that, 2015, 16. We were certainly running very heavily on the idea that we need a new constitution. We all know Britain is not a democracy, and the government has 100% of the power with 44% of the votes. But how do we fix that? The AV referendum in 2011 got a lot bogged down in the detail of the system. Our suggestion is form a convention, a people's assembly, a constitutional assembly, and that decides what the new constitution should look like. And of course, we've got ideas of what it should be, but you actually let the people decide. And sort of trialling that on a local level, the Electoral Reform Society ran two sample ones. It was all done in a bit of a hurry, and it wasn't exactly ideal, but they did it in Southampton and Sheffield. And I actually was at the meeting where they did a big debrief and report, and they had lots of academic study, academic experts followed the whole process through, interviewed all the people. And I got to talk to quite a lot of the people who were involved actually on the assemblies. And the one I remember specifically, because it was a really interesting discussion, was a retired newsagent from Southampton. And he wasn't very much, a man from our side of politics. In fact, he'd always been a small business person who'd been very, very focused on his business and never really thought about politics at all. But he just retired, and this opportunity came up, and he kind of thought, oh, well, that sounds interesting. And he just got really engaged and really involved and really interested in politics. And he could tell you how he'd changed lots of his views. And it was a really great case study for how engagement in a citizens' assembly can really change people's minds, change who approaches, people get engaged in an honest kind of way. Of course, the one that most people perhaps will have heard of is, unfortunately, it sort of arrived at bad timing, was the climate change citizens assembly that was set up by the House of Commons, that ran sort of at the start of COVID, and then they did some sessions virtually like this. And that was looking at the idea of where, how Britain would get to net zero by 2050, actually asking people to look at that, the results of that. Now, I've heard a speaker or two who was involved in that speaking on that, and they seem to think that despite the obvious problems of COVID, it went pretty well. But we're going to actually be hearing in the next few weeks some bigger and fuller reports from that, so it'll be interesting to see what they say. The other thing that I know a little bit about is the Ministry of Housing and Local Government actually ran a trial that was called the Innovation in Democracy Programme. And they had 3 local authorities trialling citizen assemblies on local issues. So the 3 of them were Dudley, Trent Valley, and Greater Cambridge Authority. And the first 2 did citizens' assemblies on what their town centres should look like, how they should be reshaped. And the third one, Greater Cambridge, looked at congestion, public transport, all the issues around getting people around. And it's interesting that I have on perhaps some surprising testimony on how well those went, because I was actually at a meeting of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Deliberative Democracy, which is a group of parliamentarians, peers and MPs who are keen on all forms of deliberative democracy, but as you'd expect, citizens' assemblies is one of the things they talk about a lot. And Baroness Barron, who's a Tory minister, junior minister, came along to us and talked to us about this. And it was really quite fun and quite exciting, because she had the absolute zeal of a convert. She thought citizens' assemblies, she'd been really sceptical about this idea, but she'd actually followed them closely, and they were amazing. They were great. So we've got at least one Tory advocate of citizens' assemblies in perhaps not quite the centre of government, but certainly there. So the other thing that I should mention is the international. I mentioned that Ireland is the place that's probably been the world leader in this area. And in Ireland, they've had a whole very successful ongoing process, but 2 particular things that a citizens' assembly did was they led to both their equal marriage referendum and their referendum on abortion rights. And they're really interesting case studies for members of the public from a country that had, on those sorts of issues, been seen as a small c conservative. And the Citizens' Assembly led way in front of where politicians were brave enough to go. And so sometimes, perhaps more often than we think, citizens can be actually much more leaders in politics if you give them the chance through something like the Citizens' Assembly. So I'm going to stop in a minute, but just sort of a couple of final thoughts. When might a Citizens' Assembly be a bad idea? Because it's always interesting to think about these things as well. And I think one of the things to say is that there's a real risk, and I might perhaps apply this particularly to a Tory government, that a Citizens' Assembly is a way of kicking something into the long grass. Oh, you've got this difficult problem. You don't really want to have to deal with it yourself as a government or a council. Traditionally one calls an inquiry or a royal commission or forms a committee. Well, we'll call a Citizens' Assembly and it's not our problem anymore. And that's something, you know, anytime anyone says Citizens Assembly, you do have to ask the question whether that's what's happening. The other thing I think is that you really need to think about what kinds of things they can and can't do. And I don't have a full, complete answer on this, but I think you eventually get to the point, and I don't have it so much these days. Perhaps citizens' assemblies have replaced it, but it used to be that when I did public meetings, there was always someone who got up and said, "Well, why don't we have a complete deliberative democracy? And you know, you can do it all electronically these days. So let the public decide everything. Don't have any elected representatives. Just do everything by the public deciding everything." And you know, my argument for one of my arguments with that has always been that that requires a level of engagement and time from the public that's utterly unrealistic, even if we go to a 4-day working week as standard with no loss of pay. And I don't think the public really want to decide on, you know, what the regulations should be for the running of breweries or something. There's a kind of level of things that's too low, but perhaps there's also some things that are simply too complicated. And I'll be interested to see what comes out of the Climate Assembly, because I think there are real questions of when you have to engage in some very complex issues. You know, it's easy enough to say, well, how do we want to get our energy? And, you know, we want lots of renewables. We don't want fracking, lots of things like that. One particular area you might be able to decide. But if you're starting to really think, you know, to engage with the issues that we would as Greens, to say, well, you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. We're going to have less stuff. How can we do that? Maybe a 4-day working week is one way of doing that. Maybe a UBI is another way of doing that. You're basically creating a whole model of society, and I'm not quite sure how you can do that with the Citizens Assembly. So maybe, you know, things like big national issues, as in Ireland with abortion and equal marriage, maybe it's where you've got a very discrete but really difficult, hard problem that's really got stuck in politics. Maybe getting a truly representative group of people together and having that discussion is a really good way forward. And that's something that you can do at any kind of local level. And, you know, the other thing is I did actually have some discussion at one of these local party meetings with a group of Greens, and they were saying, you know, well, what can we do? And I was saying, you know, it's not impossible with Citizens Assembly very much on the agenda that local councillors or even just people as local campaigners could step forward and set up something that, you know, make a reasonable effort to get a representative group, introduce that deliberative element, and do it on how do we solve the traffic problems on Green Road. And, you know, maybe that would be an interesting way of getting people involved and engaged in a different way of doing things. But, you know, the trick is not to make it turn up into a public meeting where the usual suspects get up and say and have their stuff. But anyway, I think it's a really fascinating idea, an exciting model that the Green Party is very much been championing. So I look forward to seeing what others have to say about it. We can do our own sort of little mini Citizens Assembly in the next 15 minutes or so.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for that Natalie. That's I think that's given us a lot of food for thought. And so the logical thing now is if people want to chip in and ask questions, make points, it doesn't have to be questions to Natalie. Then if you indicate, and I'm happy with just waving your finger because almost everyone's visible, and if you're so okay. Rosie has put up a hand, so Rosie.
Yeah.
I'll make a note of people who've also put a name of hands up.
I might be picking up on quite a boring thing to begin the questions with, but you mentioned at the beginning how it's important to have a very accurate representation of who lives in the area. How can you sort of go about doing that? Is that by encouraging certain numbers of certain people to come, or do you have to limit people if they wanted to come, but you know that made it not representative? Yeah, how would you go about that?
Well, I think what you'd have to do is try and get some information. And I mean, if you were going to do this, for example, on a ward level, you usually have, you know how many people are from various ethnic backgrounds are in a ward. You know what the age distribution is in a ward. You know, you usually have a whole lot of stats on education levels and that. If you were going to try and do this on this sort of basis, yes, you would essentially have to exclude people because we all know who the overrepresented groups of people who put their hand up would be. And so, you know, if you were going to try and do this, I think, you know, you'd have to make it very clear how this is going to be representative, ask people to put themselves forward, and say, you know, we're only going to take, you know, 3 middle-class white women in their 30s, whatever, you know, select those, but put that in, you know, it would be quite a big job and you might have to do it somewhat imperfectly. But then I think where the key thing would be in many ways would be you would be restricting some people, but you'd have to really go and look to find, people from certain groups. Where do you find people, say, with only 4 years of high school, or, people who work in manual jobs or something? You might have to really go and look for those people. And, that's not going to be easy. That's why I sort of said if you're going to do it on a local level, you'd probably end up with something that was kind of imperfect, but at least try and, get something that's getting the idea across and trying to draw some different people in. You could do it in a sort of halfway house kind of way.
Yeah.
Kia, you wanted to make a point, or where?
No, it was the same question about selection. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else?
There's a question from Kath in the chat.
Where are we?
It's more or less the same question, but on a big national one, for example, how are the people chosen? Do you happen to know in Ireland for the discussions on abortion, or in this country on the Citizens Assembly on climate change? Is a company send out invitations?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it was the sort of company that normally does polling, and so has a lot of idea about demographics and that, and they did a very careful process, and it was very transparently done and very open. I've actually just put in the chat box an example from a piece from The Guardian about a participant who was involved in the Irish one, and also I've just put in the link for the local government trial. But in Ireland, I think effectively, people wouldn't tend to trust the government if they did it. But if you've got a respected polling organisation, that would be an obvious place to start. And, if it's all done in a transparent way and they set out their methodology and technical experts can look at it, then, I haven't seen any serious challenges to the methodology in Ireland. So, it can be done, I think, if you put the resources into it. It's not terribly cheap, obviously.
Jim, you indicated you want to say something. You're on mute, Jim.
Yeah, along the same lines, do you see it a bit like jury service? And do you think that would be a way of choosing people for the citizens' assemblies?
I mean, the problem with that is that that's people on the electoral roll, and that so you would immediately be losing. There's something like 13% of people who aren't on the electoral roll. And that's going to be very much biased towards young, disadvantaged. So, again, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But that wouldn't be the ideal place I'd start if you want to do something really big and serious. If you were going to do, a local citizens assembly on the traffic or something, and that was you thought was the way you could do it, it wouldn't be the end of the world starting with that. But you might want to think about, a way of trying to at least get a couple of people who aren't on the electoral roll by some mechanism, just because they're probably a group in their own right.
Okay. Anyone else got any points or questions at this point?
I would like to ask, from the examples you've cited, or from your direct experience of citizens' assemblies, how are the decisions of the citizens' assemblies used? I mean, is it possible that they can just be ignored?
Yes, and I think that's a real problem, that, if you're going to ask people to give up significant periods of their time, put real energy and concentration and focus into this. I mean, for example, the ERS, Electoral Reform Society ones that I said, they were trials and they didn't have any real impact. And so the people I'd met who were the ones who came to the final wrap-up had taken it very seriously and got very involved. But I think, there's a real risk that, people are not, to do something seriously like this, you're going to probably ask people to give up at least a couple of weekends to sit in a room, to really pay attention to people presenting them, potentially, with some quite challenging, difficult evidence. People who aren't used to the idea of, sitting in a lecture theatre, being lectured by a lecturer, are going to have to do that. If you're going to get people really properly to engage, really to sort of, sit there, listen to someone who they think is a total idiot, mouth off just because they're really respecting the process and making sure everyone has their say. If you don't have that kind of sense of this is something that's really worth doing behind it, I think you're going to struggle to get it to work well. And, at the end of the day, what's the point if you're not actually going to put this effort in and use it in a really constructive way at the end of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Green Party policy would be to use citizens' assemblies on a whole range of issues, and to make sure that the outcomes were played a big influence on political decision making.
Yes, I mean, if you look at the policies for a sustainable society, we've always, even before the idea really of Citizens Assembly certainly became popular, I'm not quite sure where it originated, we've always talked about participatory democracy. And if we take, for example, the previous time that we were running Brighton and Hove Council, we did some work there on sort of something of a precursor of Citizens Assembly, which is the idea of participatory budgeting. And there they gave quite significant chunks of money, I can't remember the figure now, but to each ward. And through the same kind of process, rather than just asking people, oh, you've got this pot of money, what do you want to spend on it? And everyone just fighting it out. They actually really, did some proper participatory budgeting, which involves, asking people to look at what the issues are in the ward, hearing from experts, hearing from campaigners, hearing different things. And then at the end of that deliberative process, then actually making decisions on spending money. So I think you can take that whole participatory budgeting, and it's something that if you were to Google participatory budgeting, you'd find there's a whole global long-term discussion on that, and that's kind of the precursor, I think, to citizens' assemblies. And indeed, they don't rule each other out. You could also still do participatory budgeting as a way of really getting people to engage in the decisions that are made in their communities, and how their money, when we think about tax dollars, how their money's spent.
Cool. I'll just remind people, if you want to speak or make a point, if you just indicate by waving your finger, and I'll put you on the list. I've got a sort of general sort of question of what's the level of support that both the Tory and the Labour Party are giving towards citizens' assemblies. I'm sure there are individuals within it who are quite supportive, but in terms of the party policies of Tory and Labour, where are they standing?
I think you'll find, in terms of Labour, you'll find a lot of lip service. I don't actually know, to be honest, whether it was actually in their. They're not in favour of reforming the constitution significantly, so they wouldn't be going for a People's Constitutional Convention. I'm sure you would get lip service paid to it, but they are, they have a very centralising, autocratic kind of tendency. So I think if Bush came to sub, there'd be some risk of ending up with a kind of, oh yes, we'll have a talking shop, but we'll still decide how to do things. Oddly enough, I think the Tories would find it harder to oppose them because it so ties up with their kind of rhetoric but I still wouldn't really expect them to actually, institute one with real power. But I think they're likely to encourage, more of these local ones, more of this decision making. And, you might say in some ways that's also an attempt to undercut local government, as they're doing in so many other ways. And we're likely to see a white paper coming out very soon doing that. But sometimes what can happen is when you let the genie out of the bottle, if citizens' assemblies really catch on as an idea that the public gets really excited about, in some ways I think that's the strongest force, is that if we get people out there saying, well, I took part in that citizens' assembly and it was really good and it really made a difference, and that create a whole groups and groups of people talking like that. When you also are faced with an intractable problem, for a politician, it does give them an out, and that might be a bad thing or it might be a good thing. So I think there are individuals, neither of them is really a big advocate for it. I think the Lib Dems, probably for what they're worth, probably are fairly into it. But I think we're always going to be the people who are the real champions, the real leaders on this, as on so many other issues.
Cool. Kia, you indicated again.
Yeah, I get what Natalie's saying about the attitude of the major parties centrally, but from my experience, I do think you'd have a fairly good chance of getting Labour, certainly, and I think also the Tories and definitely the Lib Dems on board at a local level, which I would have thought would be where we'd be wanting to concentrate our efforts. And then you get that groundswell that Natalie was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the challenge locally is probably going to be to do it anything like properly takes a reasonable amount of resources, and the resources in local government at the moment are a problem. And maybe that's where the Tories ran this trial that I put the link in the chat box about. Something actually you just made me think that I'll ask the government a written question actually about what their plans are to progress and advance this further. Because if there was some national government money behind it, that would make it a lot easier for local councils to act.
Yeah. Okay, I'm looking for anyone indicating they want to come in. I can't see anyone. Oh, Sue, yeah. Go.
You talking to me?
Yep, Sue, can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry, I was just unmuting.
All right.
What if your Citizens Assembly decides something that you really don't like, oh, let's get rid of all the immigrants, or let's massive bypass? What do you do then?
Well, that's a tricky one in terms of I've said that they should have real decision-making power. It's a question of what you're prepared to put under question, and that's something that I think you're still giving the politicians, the government, the council, whatever, the power to decide what questions are. And the obvious example for this might be the just had some terrible child murder. The tabloids are going absolutely crazy, and you go, oh, let's have a citizens' assembly on capital punishment. Would probably be a very bad idea. I'm almost confident now that you wouldn't actually get to a really bad place in the end, but you never know. But so I think it's a question of you have to actually, as a politician, it's your responsibility to decide what the appropriate things are to put to questions. And if you take that capital punishment a moment, also to think about what circumstances you're asking them in. I mean, we know that political change happens very quickly in sudden leaps, and we might want to, let's say, in an area where there's been massive flooding, we might like to call the Citizens Assembly and say, hey, we're going to ban driven grass shooting, to pick a topical subject. But I think if you were going to do the whole thing honestly and in a way it wouldn't rebound on you politically, you still have to make sure it's done at an appropriate time, not the week after the floods, right, we're going to call it a Citizens Assembly in a week's time, and everyone's in a kind of knee-jerk reaction at that moment. It might be tempting to do that, but my advice would be that you need to make sure there is not just proper sober consideration and deliberation within the Citizens Assembly, it also has to happen in the right environment. But it can be a difficult environment. If you think about Ireland on both abortion and equal marriage, those were two hot political issues, but they were sort of long-term political issues that it wasn't just in the heat of the moment. So I guess a heat of a moment, Citizens Assembly is innately probably a bad idea.
Keir, you indicated again.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. But to me, one of the real values of the Citizens Assembly type of approach is that you're going behind the headlines. You're going into the nuance to some extent. So those kinds of tabloid knee-jerk reactions that we would want to avoid, you're less likely to get them, I would have thought.
Well, that's what you find. I mean, some case studies with the participatory democracy, and I'm not an expert on participatory democracy, but I've heard quite a few talks on it. And one of the things that you think there's a risk. Well, okay, here's quite a large chunk of money, and and I think they do this in Brighton actually. One of the you might be making choices for a range of things of how you spend it on social care. Now, disabled children, for example, are a group that are might really, really need that money, might really, really need that support. But there won't be, if you have a representative group of local families, there won't be a large number of families with disabled children in there to be the advocates for that. So you're really going to need to make sure that the deliberative process, has expert testimony, has evidence, gives people time to really think about, well, we actually know our society is deeply discriminatory. We really need to do more to support disabled people and particularly disabled children. So we're going to put the money into that rather than necessarily a nice, sexy skate park or something that might be more immediately obviously popular, but might be addressing the greatest needs in a community. And the evidence from participatory budgeting is that people make what we would consider and what most people out from the outside consider to be really decent decisions, not just knee-jerk decisions.
Okay. I don't. Oh, someone's indicated Catronia. Is that right? I got your name right?
It's Katrina, but
Katrina. Okay, right. I'm dyslexic. There you go. That's makes sense.
it's fine. Yeah, I guess it's a bit more of a nitty-gritty question, because I'm thinking if you get a room full of essentially kind of a cross section of any given society in a room, there's going to be a real kind of variety of confidence and power in that room. And how do you make sure that that doesn't play out in the decision-making process, and actually people's voices can be heard without feeling kind of overwhelmed by other people?
That's a really good question, actually, and that's an area that I probably missed out on in the discussion and we haven't got to. And I think if the link I shared in the chat box from the Irish participant commented on how good the chair was, and he thought that the chair had done a really excellent job. And it is a really skilled job to actually manage a process like this. And, you can well imagine it getting out of control. I'm having a flashback at the moment to, it wasn't a Citizens Assembly, but I used to live in Somers Town in central London, and it was a very difficult, very poor, disadvantaged community. And someone had the bright idea of throwing £1 million at this community. And this immediately just caused a most enormous amount of conflicts, basically this enormous fight over the £1 million. And at one point they brought in this outside mediator to attempt to, bring some sort of sensible discussion to this. And we ended up with an outside mediator in tears and me having to try and stop the meeting dissolving into total chaos. So it's a difficult job. And again, when we're talking about, money, you're probably going to have to pay someone quite well to do that. So that's one of the challenges is that, and if you think about, splitting into small groups, you're going to have good people on each one of those tables to make sure that everyone participates and gets involved and has a go. So that is part of your whole resources you've got to put in to do this properly, is to get really good people who know what they're doing and are seen as not having any kind of a horse in the race, who are seen as independent, to help get these things to work, and ensure that that really quiet old man or that young 18-year-old who perhaps left school early and doesn't have a lot of confidence, how do you get them participating and involved and engaged? And that's not simple.
Is Anne, yes.
I'm just thinking, listening to all this, and it all sounds terribly new. Does it sound as if it would be possible to have a practice run or something, or have a group of people together on something that wasn't really terribly vital, but just to get us used to the idea of doing it and discussing it and finding out where the problems lie?
I think this has been trialled quite a lot, and so the principle and the ideas are quite well established and quite well known. And there's quite a large academic literature. I said the Electoral Reform Society, what they did was studied by academics to within an inch of every 5 minutes was covered by 3 academics, kind of thing. So there's a lot of study on it. I think the thing is to actually get the people involved. I think what you need, again, we come back to kind of chairing and process, is that you explain it really clearly at the start. And again, looking at the link I put in the chat box from the Irish guy, he talks about how it was explained to them, and someone came to his door and talked about how, this is a big national thing, obviously, so they put a lot of resources into it. They really got people engaged to the point where they thought this was a really serious thing, and they were, he talks about being nervous when he comes along as the first morning, because this is a really important thing that he's doing and he's really taking this very seriously. So I don't think you can kind of do a trial run in that sense, but you could probably do a kind of icebreaker. You would probably do a kind of icebreakery thing at the start, a little bit like we just did, to get the people starting to feel like a team. They're all in this together. But I think the way you set this up and sold it to people and how you invited people would be an important part of doing that.
Cool. And anyone else with any? I'm looking for indications. I've got one one thing that suddenly got to me, because I don't think, I may have missed it, but I don't think you talked about the size of a citizens' assembly, because I mean, I think in terms of the size of a school group, that if you have like 10, then there'll be some children who don't have friends. Whereas if you get up to 30, probably everyone's going to have friends, but then a group of 30 is difficult to handle. So what is the sort of size of one of these?
I think in most cases, I mean, there's obviously a dynamic between how you manage the group dynamics, and also just what resources you've got, and so therefore how much you can afford. And actually, that's something we also haven't talked about. I mean, there's an interesting question of, if you're asking people to give up a serious amount of time, do you pay them? And that's a really interesting question in its own right. If you get to value what they're doing, if okay, you can do it on weekends, but that's not going to work for everybody. If you decide you want to do it in the week and pay people their salary so they can take the time off work or whatever. But I think one of the best case studies, and the ones that's most highly regarded, is Ireland, where they had 99 people to represent the whole country. So it doesn't have to be enormous, and I would rather think in terms of, we think about what it's like, say, with Green Party conference, which typically has 500 or 600 people. That's not particularly easy to manage, and it's not easy to get lots of people having a say. So I think somewhere around about the 99 for Ireland is kind of a maximum. If you were going to do something in a local council area or something, I can kind of picture something like 30 as being a kind of manageable kind of level that would be kind of practical, and you could find a big enough room and you could feed them, and it wouldn't cost an arm and a leg and all of that. But actually, just on that point of, I mean, it applies not just to Citizens Assembly, but to the whole issue of consultations. I've long been fascinated. I was at City University in an event on food policy, and there's a really excellent food group in Brighton and Hove that works with people from with drug and alcohol problems and mental health issues and those sorts of things. And they have a policy that anyone who takes part in any of their consultations, who contributes to their research, will get some form of payment. They can't always make it money. Sometimes it's vouchers or something like that. And what they also do, which I think is very exciting and very interesting, is they try and also, when they present the findings, take at least one of the participants along with them. And so the participant gets to actually present the findings as well. So rather than, an expert drawing all this knowledge from a room of people who are consultees, and the expert gets a nice trip off to the other end of the country and stay in a nice hotel and give a talk and, enhance their professional standing, you actually get people involved. And so, one of the things, maybe if you, after you've had the Citizens Assembly, there's something to think about, making sure that those people, if they want to, at least can keep contributing, rather than just experts reporting on what they all said.
Cool. Okay, I'm looking for anyone else indicating. Yes, we have Saxon. Yes.
Forgive me, I'm quite ignorant about this. Are these assemblies recognised, and by whom? Who supplies the funding? How do we go about funding this sort of thing? Because money's being talked about, and paying people for attending, that sort of thing.
I think what pretty well all of them have happened in one way or another is there've been a government decides this is the way it's going to, or a council decides this is the way it's going to make a decision. So it's going to make this decision by funding this group. And, if you think about it, if a council or a government was normally going to make a decision, they might employ a whole lot of experts to write reports and that. So in some ways, instead of, and you might involve these experts in this to some degree anyway, but perhaps you're taking the resources in making the decision in a different way, and so that might save you some money in one area that you then use this way. But yeah, and I mean, the Electoral Reform Society one, that was funded by a trust that just wanted to experiment with the whole idea, particularly when they were really focused on the idea of a People's Constitutional Convention to draw up a new constitution for the UK.
Thank you.
Anyone else wish to come in, or any other points? Okay, in that case, I'm going to say let's round that off there. I think that's been quite an interesting discussion. I certainly know a damn sight more about it than I did before, and I've got lots of thoughts about how could we use this concept, and who could we persuade to give us the money to do it, and all that sort of stuff. So thank you, Natalie, for that. That was very useful, and I enjoyed it. That was all that political fun stuff. Feel free to stay for the next bit, but also as a general principle of Zooms, if you have to go or you want to go, you can just go. That's not.
Okay, well, I'm afraid I've got 3 speeches or 3 things to do in the house tomorrow, so I might head off with that. But lovely to see everybody and nice to chat, and I enjoyed the discussion. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
You.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.